Have you ever caught a glimpse of something disturbing within yourself? A sudden rage that seemed disproportionate, a jealousy that felt primitive, or a selfish impulse that shocked you? Carl Jung, one of history's most profound psychological thinkers, identified a pattern that exists within every human being. A pattern so threatening to our self-image that most people spend their entire lives denying its existence. There exists within you a collection of traits, impulses, and capacities that you've rejected from your conscious identity. This hidden dimension doesn't vanish when denied. It grows stronger in the darkness, influencing your behavior in ways you cannot recognize. Jung called this phenomenon the shadow, and he considered confronting it the most essential and dangerous psychological work any person can undertake. Ancient wisdom traditions have always acknowledged this inner darkness, but Jung articulated what our ancestors intuited, that the most destructive force in human life isn't external evil, but the disowned aspects of ourselves that operate beyond our awareness. The most disturbing reality, this shadow manifests in even the most seemingly virtuous individuals, and when left unconfronted, it can sabotage everything you value. The shadow represents everything you believe you are not. Imagine this. From earliest childhood, you learned which qualities were acceptable in your family and culture. To secure love and belonging, you embraced these traits while banishing their opposites from your conscious identity. If kindness was valued, you repressed cruelty. If intelligence was praised, you denied your limitations. If strength was admired, you buried weakness. These rejected aspects didn't disappear. They were merely relegated to your unconscious mind, forming what Jung called the shadow. Everyone carries a shadow, Jung wrote, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. This repository of disowned traits continues to grow throughout your life, accumulating energy and autonomy in the depths of your psyche. What makes the shadow truly dangerous is not its contents, but your blindness to it. The more completely you deny these aspects, the more control they gain over your life. As Jung observed, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. Your unacknowledged rage, greed, selfishness, or lust finds expression through seemingly inexplicable behaviors, self-sabotage, and unconscious choices that create precisely the outcomes you consciously claim to fear. Ancient spiritual traditions recognize this phenomenon millennia before Jung. In Hinduism, the concept of the dweller on the threshold represents the accumulated shadow material that must be faced before spiritual advancement. Buddhist teachings speak of Mara not as an external demon, but as the projected contents of one's own unacknowledged darkness. Even Jesus' admonition to remove the beam from your own eye before addressing the speck in another's speaks to this universal psychological reality. What makes shadow material so difficult to recognize is that you've designed your conscious identity specifically to exclude these qualities. You don't just deny these aspects, you actively define yourself by their absence. I would never be cruel, you insist, while unconsciously undermining colleagues. I'm not materialistic, you claim, while secretly envying others' possessions. I'm always rational, you believe, while emotions drive your most important decisions. Contemporary neuroscience has confirmed Jung's insights. Research on implicit bias and unconscious processing demonstrates that what we consciously reject doesn't disappear from our psychological functioning. Studies on moral licensing show how our conscious virtuous identity can actually increase the likelihood of unconscious shadow behavior. The more strongly you identify as good, the more likely your shadow will emerge in unexpected ways. But how do you recognize your own shadow when your psyche is designed to keep it hidden from you? The most reliable indicator appears in your emotional reactions. When someone triggers disproportionate anger, disgust, or contempt in you, you're likely encountering your own disowned material projected outward. The qualities that most disturb you in others almost certainly exist, unacknowledged, within yourself. This psychological principle explains why the harshest critics of any behavior often harbor secret desires for that very action. The colleague who constantly suspects others of laziness may be fighting their own work avoidance tendencies. The moralist obsessed with others' sexual behavior frequently struggles with their own unacknowledged desires. As Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. What you're experiencing in these moments of judgmental intensity is the external manifestation of an internal conflict. You're not actually fighting against the other person, but against the disowned parts of yourself that they've inadvertently activated. This is why your emotional reactions can seem so wildly disproportionate. They're fueled by the accumulated energy of years of repression. The most alarming aspect of shadow projection is that it distorts your perception of reality. You don't see the actual person before you, but a screen onto which you project your disowned material. In the grip of projection, you'll misinterpret neutral actions as hostile, innocent remarks as insulting, and normal behavior as threatening. Your capacity for accurate understanding collapses when the shadow is activated. Jung observed that this distortion creates a peculiar certainty, an absolute conviction that your negative judgments about others are objectively true, not projections of your own disowned traits. This certainty remains immune to evidence or rational argument because it's not based on objective perception, but on the psyche's desperate need to maintain separation from its disowned aspects. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, Jung wrote. And herein lies perhaps the greatest danger of shadow denial, the development of what Jung termed the inflation of the moral ego. When you define yourself exclusively by your virtues while projecting all negative qualities onto others, you create an artificial self-image of moral superiority. The person caught in moral inflation inhabits a psychological state more dangerous than simple arrogance. They experience themselves not merely as better than others, but as fundamentally different, a being who has transcended the baser aspects of human nature. This inflation manifests as an unshakable certainty in one's rightness and an inability to recognize one's capacity for error or harm. The 20th century Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz observed that this state represents the most dangerous form of unconsciousness, more threatening than acknowledging one's darkness. It is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, she wrote, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. This moral inflation creates a peculiar blindness. While great spiritual teachers throughout history, from Buddha to Jesus to contemporary mystics, acknowledged their struggles with shadow material, the morally inflated person remains convinced of their fundamental goodness, immune to self-doubt. They can cause tremendous harm while remaining convinced of their benevolent intentions. The warning sign of this dangerous state appears when you notice someone who never questions their own goodness, who sees evil only in others, never in themselves. Their certainty about their moral purity stands in stark contrast to the humble self-questioning of genuinely integrated individuals. As Jung noted, filling the conscious mind with ideal conceptions is a characteristic of Western theosophy, but not the confrontation with the shadow and the world of darkness. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The modern spiritual teacher A.H. Almaas described this dynamic as spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts or practices to avoid confronting psychological shadow material. This creates what he calls the holy person, someone who uses spiritual identity to further suppress shadow awareness. The danger in this pattern lies in how effectively spiritual language can be used to rationalize projection and judgment while maintaining an illusion of transcendence. How does this moral inflation manifest in everyday life? Observe those who are constantly preoccupied with the moral failings of others while displaying absolute certainty about their own righteousness. Notice those who divide the world neatly into good and evil, placing themselves firmly on the side of light. The more absolute their certainty, the more complete their shadow denial likely is. But an equally dangerous pattern exists at the opposite extreme, what Jung called identification with the shadow. This occurs when a person abandons moral restraint entirely, embracing their destructive impulses while rationalizing them as authenticity or freedom from convention. This person hasn't integrated their shadow but has been consumed by it, often after years of rigid moral suppression. The psychological danger signs are dramatically different here. Instead of rigid moral certainty, you'll notice a perverse pride in breaking taboos, a celebration of darkness, and a contemptuous attitude toward ordinary moral concerns. This pattern represents not shadow integration but shadow possession. The conscious personality has been overwhelmed by previously repressed material. Jung documented numerous cases where individuals swung from extreme moral inflation to complete shadow identification, sometimes within remarkably short periods. The televangelist who preaches moral purity before being discovered in the very behaviors he condemned, the anti-corruption politician revealed to be accepting bribes, the moral crusader exposed as secretly engaging in their targeted vice. These dramatic falls exemplify the psychological principle that what is denied does not disappear, but grows stronger in the unconscious. What is perhaps most disturbing about shadow possession is how it can occur gradually, without the person recognizing their transformation. Small compromises accumulate, each rationalized away, until the individual has become precisely what they once condemned, all while maintaining an illusion of consistency. As Jung observed, the shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. But there exists a third state that is perhaps the most psychologically dangerous of all, what Jung termed partial shadow integration. This occurs when a person intellectually acknowledges their shadow without emotionally experiencing it. They can speak articulately about their dark side while remaining fundamentally disconnected from its emotional reality. This partial integration creates what contemporary Jungian psychologists call the enlightened shadow, the use of psychological awareness to further ego inflation. Yes, we all have a shadow, this person might say, while subtly implying that their shadow awareness places them above those caught in unconscious projection. Their shadow knowledge becomes yet another basis for superiority rather than a gateway to genuine humility. The warning sign of this subtle danger appears when someone speaks of their shadow with peculiar detachment, as if it were an interesting psychological concept rather than the source of their own capacity for destruction. True shadow integration is always accompanied by emotional recognition, the shattering realization of one's personal capacity for the very behaviors and qualities one has most judged in others. Jung himself warned about this danger. There is a deep gulf between what a man is and what he represents, between what he is as an individual and what he is as a collective being. His function is developed at the expense of his individuality. Psychological knowledge itself can become a mask, a substitute for genuine confrontation with the shadow's emotional reality. What makes this partial integration so dangerous is its convincing disguise as psychological maturity. The partially integrated person can discuss their shadow with apparent insight while remaining fundamentally defended against its emotional impact. They've developed what Winnicott called a false self, a psychological structure that mimics integration while serving as a sophisticated defense against genuine vulnerability. But what happens when the shadow is neither projected, identified with, nor intellectualized, but genuinely confronted? This brings us to the transformative path that Jung considered essential to psychological wholeness: conscious shadow integration. This process represents the fundamental difference between those trapped in destructive patterns and those moving towards psychological maturity. Shadow integration doesn't mean perfection or an absence of darkness. Rather, it involves the humble acknowledgement of your full humanity, your capacity for all the qualities you've observed and judged in others. As Jung famously remarked, "I'd rather be whole than good," a statement pointing to the difference between authentic psychological integrity and a fragmented psyche, maintaining an illusion of moral perfection. All spiritual traditions, beneath their doctrinal differences, point toward this same psychological work. Sufism speaks of nafs, the confrontation with one's lower nature, as a prerequisite for spiritual development. Christian mysticism emphasizes kenosis, self-emptying of moral pretension. Zen practice shatters intellectual constructs that separate us from direct experience of our complete nature. These diverse paths converge on the same psychological reality Jung articulated, that wholeness requires integrating what we've denied. How can you recognize someone who has truly begun this integration process? The signs are unmistakable, a peculiar combination of moral humility and psychological strength. They don't claim moral perfection yet demonstrate ethical commitment. They acknowledge their capacity for darkness without indulging it. They respond to others' shadow behaviors with compassion rather than self-righteous judgment. recognizing the universal human struggle with disowned aspects. Modern neuroscience supports Jung's understanding of integration. Researchers studying contemplative practices have documented how shadow integration literally creates new neural connections between primitive limbic regions where emotions originate and prefrontal areas responsible for self-awareness. What was neurologically split becomes connected, allowing conscious awareness of previously automatic reactions. The most transformative aspect of this process is that conscious shadow recognition dramatically reduces unconscious shadow expression. As Jung noted, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. When you acknowledge your capacity for rage, you're less likely to act it out unconsciously. When you recognize your jealousy, you're less controlled by its unconscious influence. What you own, you can choose how to express. The integrated person displays a unique quality of psychological flexibility, the capacity to access different aspects of themselves as situations require, without becoming rigidly identified with any single quality. They can access strength without denying vulnerability, rationality without suppressing emotion, assertion without losing compassion. This flexibility contrasts sharply with the psychological rigidity of those defending against shadow awareness. Genuine spiritual teachers throughout history have embodied this integration. The Dalai Lama speaks openly of his struggles with anger. Teresa of Avila acknowledged her periods of spiritual aridity and temptation. Jesus demonstrated righteous anger without losing compassion. This honest acknowledgement of their full humanity stands in stark contrast to those claiming moral or spiritual perfection while projecting all darkness outward. The most reliable indicator of shadow integration is genuine humility paired with personal power, not the false humility that masks pride, but the authentic recognition of one's limited perspective and capacity for error. This humility manifests not as self-deprecation, but as a quality of psychological groundedness, a comfort with being imperfectly human rather than an inflated projection of perfection. As Jung observed, where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling. The integrated person doesn't need to suppress emotion to remain rational, nor abandon reason to experience feeling. The artificial splits created by shadow denial, mind versus heart, strength versus vulnerability, discipline versus spontaneity, begin to heal through the integration process, creating a more cohesive and complete psychological functioning. The path of shadow integration isn't completed in a single insight or experience. Rather, it's an ongoing process of bringing consciousness to previously unconscious material. Each time you recognize a projection, each moment you acknowledge a disowned quality, each instance where you accept rather than deny a difficult emotion, you're engaging in this essential work of psychological maturation. This journey isn't optional for anyone seeking genuine psychological development. As Jung emphasized, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The confrontation with shadow material inevitably involves discomfort, the shattering of cherished self-images, the grief of recognizing harm you've caused through unconscious action, the anxiety of acknowledging qualities you've spent a lifetime denying. Yet this painful process leads to what Jung called the treasure hard to attain, a more complete and authentic selfhood. The energy previously used to maintain splits and projections becomes available for creative expression. The wisdom gained through shadow confrontation brings deeper compassion for others' struggles. The humility developed through shadow recognition creates more genuine connections. Before we part, I ask you, have you recognized shadow patterns operating in your own life? What qualities do you most harshly judge in others that might represent disowned aspects of yourself? What emotions trigger disproportionate reactions that could indicate shadow material? If this message resonated with you, write "I face my shadow" in the comments. Consciousness is the first step toward transformation. Don't forget to share this content with those who might benefit from understanding these unconscious patterns. Activate the bell and subscribe for more explorations of Jung's profound insights into the human psyche.